The name of this story is January Sparrow by Patricia Polacco. Sadie, the youngest crosswhite, shuddered when she saw the paddy rollers thunder into the slave yard on their horses, dragging a runaway on the end of a rope behind them. All of the slaves had been ordered to stand at the porch rail that morning. They all feared the same thing on that plantation, Master Francis Giltner. Sadie's mama and daddy, Sarah and Adam Crosswhite, and all her brothers gripped at the rail when they saw him rolling up in his fine carriage, sitting right next to his youngest son, David, and his nephew, Francis Troutman. The paddy rollers hollered and hooped as they skidded to a dead stop, then hauled off in their horses and tussled the runaway to his feet. Sadie almost fell to her knees when she saw who it was they was dragging. It was January. He had been held so dear to her and her family for as long as she could remember. Her heart fair broke as they smote him and pushed him face down in the dirt to stake his arms and legs. Sadie knew January was fixing to run. He told her himself only 2 days before. When he upped and did it, Sadie prayed he'd cross water and make it to Indiana. But now she could see that it wasn't a flick of a sorry dog's tail afore they done caught him and brought him back. Master Giltner stood over January. This here dirt-eating, lazy, no-account known as January Drum took up and ran. "I want you all to see what happens to any brown-skinned devil that runs away from me," he thundered. Then he motioned to the 2 men holding black snake whips. They was Jimmy Lee and Willie Ford, his paddy rollers and overseers. First, Ford whipped January across his back so hard that it cracked the air. With each lash, January's flesh opened up in long red stripes almost to his rib bones. Then while Ford was taking a dipper of water, Lee commenced to whipping January in the other direction so as to make his flesh stand up in squares. Lee and Ford whipped and kicked the rags right off from him, but they couldn't make January holler. Sadie's brother Ben could hardly stand. His knees kept giving out with each stroke of the whip. Even though the master had ordered all of them to watch, Ben just hung his head. When the beating was done, Lee and Ford rubbed salt and pepper into January's open back. His skin jerked, quaked, and January twisted and puked up, but he never cried out. Sarah, Sadie's mama, stumbled past January to Master Giltner's carriage and his son David. Sarah held David's mom in her own arms when she was getting him born, but his mama died birthing him. No one knew what to do, so Sarah took that baby home with her. She took him to her own breast, even when the other slaves would say, "You loving one of the white folks is like a dog loving the hickory what beats it." But love him she did, and he loved her back. His own daddy hated the very sight of him. He blamed that baby for his wife's death. Sarah Crosswhite was the onlyest person that loved David, so when her eyes fell on his now, he turned away. By the time the sun set that evening and everyone walked through the slave yard from the fields, January was gone. Each of them looked where he had laid and bowed their heads and touched their hearts. When Sarah and the children arrived home that night, they all ate in silence. Adam, their daddy, arrived late, carrying a shovel, his clothes covered in mud, because he said he'd been digging a grave. They all knew who that grave was for. Sadie burst into tears and ran into the window light just above her cot and took a small wooden sparrow from the sill. She held the sparrow next to her cheek as tears burned in her eyes. January had whittled it just for her. She ran her fingers over each of its feathers that he had carved so carefully. She remembered January whispering to her when he put it into her hands, "It's fixing to fly, and so is I." She'd known he was going to run. She'd said nothing to no one. Now her heart ached at the thought that she hadn't told her mama and daddy. Maybe they could have stopped January. Then he wouldn't have been beaten and he'd still be here. She cried herself to sleep.